Well, hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Holbrough, and I am a pastor of a church called the Parish in Peterborough, Ontario. And I'm going to share with you some practical peacemaking stories from my experience as a pastor with this Anabaptist conviction. A couple of years ago, I was speaking at Pitch and Praise. And Pitch and Praise is a youth camp experience that has this Anabaptist persuasion. And I had challenged the students in my talk to be creative in their peacemaking. And when my talk was over, I was in the bookstore, or the book tent, and this older woman approached me. And without any introduction, without any hello, she just said almost defiantly, "Well, I still believe there's a time for war." It caught me off guard. But before I could even think, I heard myself say to her, "And I'm sure you're living your life in a way that reflects that." And she looked as startled as I had only a minute earlier. I asked her, I said, "Do you believe there's a time for greed? Do you believe there's a time for hatred?" Now she looked puzzled. She didn't see the connection. And I told her, I said, just because war can feel inevitable doesn't mean we should ever make room for it. When we say there's a time for war, we've already started to justify it in our minds by seeing it as a tool that's available in our toolbox. But war, like greed or hatred, may be part of our world. That's true. But it's not to be meant to be part of our hearts. It doesn't build anything. They only break things. And for those who say, yeah, but war is sometimes a necessary evil, I remind them that we're not called to be the government. We're called to be the church. And our calling isn't to manage violence. Our call is to imagine peace. That's what Jesus has asked us to do. We are to challenge government. We are to challenge those in leadership and authority, to hold accountable those, and to live as if another way is always possible. Because we believe in resurrection. We are resurrection people. The resurrection of dead hearts, the resurrection of life appearing where we're surprised to find it. That's what it is to be a follower of Jesus. And that conversation with that woman in that tent that day has stayed with me because it reminded me of how easily we accept violence as normative, and how easily we even consider violence at times to be spiritual, when what Jesus showed us is that peace isn't passive. Peace is prophetic. Peace isn't strategy, it's a posture that we take. And it's not just something that we talk about, it's something that we become. And here's where it gets complicated. We may say that we want peace, but what kind of peace are we actually really talking about when we use this word? We talk about this as a concept of something that we're searching for or we want. You see, I think too often we imagine peace as a kind of perfect agreement, a world where everybody finally sees things the same way, preferably mine. But come on, that's an illusion. None of us can see exactly the same way. Our vision is shaped by the stories that we carry. Our vision is shaped by our pain, by our hope, by our fears, by our truths. All of these lenses shape who we are and how we perceive. That woman in the bookstore that I met, she's proof of that to me. When somebody walks up to you who you haven't met before, and they introduce themselves by saying, "I believe there's a time for war," you know there's a story there. There's a story of hurt, perhaps a story of betrayal, perhaps a story of heartbreak. And that's what I've learned about peace. That peace doesn't start in agreement. It starts in understanding. It begins when we can look at another person, even somebody who frightens us or frustrates us and say that there's a story there. If peace depends on sameness, it will always fail us. We don't all start from the same story. And forgetting that might be the first act of violence that we commit against one another. That our idea of peace is too small, reduced to silence and uniformity rather than understanding and growth and discovery, is what has me concerned. What if instead we saw peace as a miracle? Not something we manufacture, but something we join. What if we saw peace as a posture in how we walked? Not just an argument to be won or a policy to be enforced, but what if we saw peace as this beautiful invitation into a whole new way of living and a whole new way of thinking? I often remind people that Jesus invites us, after all, to follow, not to arrive. And I know that's hard for so many to understand, because our narrow view of peace has been conditioned to mean that everybody just gets along. But that's not peace. That's conformity. Not that that doesn't happen, but if we're honest, that version of peace usually happens when somebody silently concedes to the wishes of another. But what if peace was bigger than that? What if instead of trying to create a peace that we can understand, a peace that looks like agreement, a peace that looks like comfort, or merely a peace that looks like the absence of tension, what if instead we saw peace as a miracle? I think the Apostle Paul understood it that way. He describes in his letter to the Philippians this kind of thing. He writes that the peace of God is something that passes understanding. That divine peace that depends on God is an experience that transcends our ability to even comprehend it. And perhaps the problem isn't that peace is out of reach, but what if it just refuses to fit our definitions? I guess that's what I'm saying, is that maybe we don't have to define peace for peace to define us. The peace of Christ doesn't always feel peaceful sometimes. Sometimes it unsettles us before it heals. Sometimes it confronts before it comforts. It moves us beyond understanding, beyond what's easy to explain, into this mystery of restored relationships, of wholeness, of the celebration of diversity. So maybe our task isn't to make peace smaller or safer. What if it's to lift our eyes higher? To look for a peace so deep that it can hold contradiction, that it could hold diversity, even complexity, and still, in all of that diversity, be called holy. And that kind of peace, the kind that transcends understanding, will always be misunderstood. I have lived that firsthand. When we first started the parish, we decided that we wanted to be known by our values, not by a doctrine on our website, a statement of faith somewhere. See, those things can be repeated without being understood, which too often creates the illusion that everybody agrees. But values invite relationship. Values to me hold a deeper, more accessible space for people to meet, for people to wrestle, for people to grow together. And one of our core values as a parish was discovery. this belief that God is already at work in our world. And our task is simply to notice where and how, and to join God in that sacred work. And what we stumbled into was this holistic nature of peacemaking and what peacemaking could be. We discovered in our city this agency that offered practical care for those living with HIV/AIDS. And this organization was providing medical care, counseling, a food pantry, and other services to bring a sense of peace to this marginalized community. And so I had gone to this candlelight vigil that they had held to remember those who had died in the previous 12 months. And I remember being so deeply moved. I was moved by the incredible compassion that I saw in that space that they were holding for this community. But I also noticed something else. There were no churches present, aside from me. And that moment changed me. It taught me that peacemaking doesn't start on the world stage. It starts at a table. It starts at a neighborhood. It starts in the churches that sometimes avoid. It starts in the places that churches sometimes avoid. And if peace can begin there in those spaces, among those who've been pushed to the margins, maybe it can ripple outward through larger and larger concentric circles until it touches the whole world. So we decided as a church that we would give a donation to this organization. Now, at the time, we were pretty small. We had only just begun only months earlier. We were maybe 6 months old. And I was giving the parish maybe 10 hours a week at this point. And we just didn't have a whole lot. Didn't have a whole lot of resources. We were in a rented building. We didn't have much. But we had made a decision. We made a decision that when we do find an organization that we want to support in a given year, that we would find organizations that were Christian organizations, and we would support them. But the other half of our support in a given year would go to secular organizations that we felt were making earth as it is in heaven. And so we had to seek out these organizations that weren't necessarily Christian at all, but we felt that what they were doing was what God has called us to do. And this organization was one of those. We decided to give them a large sum of money to this AIDS resource network because we also wanted to make an impact. And so we had a check written by our treasurer, and I showed up to meet the executive director, check in hand, and I sat across from her and I introduced myself as the pastor of this newly formed spiritual community called the Parish. And I told her that we'd been moved at the work that they are doing in our city. And so I slid this envelope across the table with a check in it, and I said that we would like to support the work that you're doing. And she paused. And she politely pushed the envelope back towards me and said, "Thanks, but no." I was confused. I pushed the envelope back and I said, "No, please. We see your work as divine and we want to support it. We want to be involved. Financially, we want to support what you're doing." She pushed the check back again and said, "We don't get checks from churches." She said most wouldn't agree with where we spend some of our funds. "So pardon me if I'm skeptical," she said. I saw the divide between us. But I'd come to know that God walks in that space between. I looked at her and I said, I can imagine what you've seen in the past. I can imagine what you've been told. But I said, I want you to know something, that our intentions as a church aren't to save you. Our intentions as a church are to save us. Now she looked puzzled. She said, "What are we going to save you from?" She asked. And I said, "You're going to save us from ignorance. You're going to save us from arrogance. You're going to save us from believing that God only sits in a pew or in a chair in a gymnasium on a Sunday morning, and that God isn't here bandaging up infected wounds and offering comfort. You're saving us from that." I said, "Please, we see God in your work, and we want to be a part of it. We want to support it, because you're doing what we feel Christ has called us to do, and no one's doing it but you." And that moment between us taught me. In that small mutual pause and the passing back and forth of an envelope, I realized that peace isn't a product that we hand over. It's a presence that we enter into. It's choosing to stay in the tension between worlds that don't trust each other, and to know that God walks in that space between those two worlds. And maybe that's what everyday peacemaking looks like. It's not fixing the divide, but walking faithfully within it until love has a chance to speak. Now, I shared this story with our church, and it began to shape an unspoken theology amongst the parishioners, amongst the people that were coming. It was beautiful. This unspoken idea of what it actually means to follow Jesus as peacemakers. And we were coming to see that belief is not just about knowing God, but joining God. It's not just about trusting that God's at work in our world, but believing that we can be at work in God's world, partnering with what love is already up to. We were coming to discover that our motivation to meet was being outmatched by our motivation to matter. Making a difference in our world, making a difference in our communities, and it was catching on. I remember a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from a parishioner. They were downtown, and there'd been a terrible fire. There was a low-income duplex that was burning, and the parishioner on the phone said that she was there, and she saw this single mom and her kids across the street on a lawn watching in shock as everything they had was burning and smoldering. And this parishioner, she was a nurse, and so she had been in the area, and she'd gone over to see what the commotion was. She saw the fire, and then she found herself standing among this crowd, realizing that some of the people she's standing with were actually tenants of this fire. And she called me and she said, "What can we do? What can we do? There must be something we can do." And I said, "Give me 5 minutes." And I quickly called our treasurer and the board chair, and I had them call other members of our serve team, which is our board. And within 15 minutes, somebody met this nurse downtown, and this nurse got to deliver a box of Timbits for the kids and an envelope with $500 for this single mom. No strings attached. I'll never forget the conversation I had with this nurse a week later on a Sunday morning, when she just couldn't believe that we could respond so quickly. Like literally within 25, 30 minutes of her discovering this, she's giving this money of support to a woman who's watching her own, duplex or her where she lived burn to the ground. She just couldn't believe that we respond so quickly. And I explained to her that when you believe that part of the reason why we exist as a church is to make earth as it is in heaven, there should be no bureaucracy. And so we found a way to streamline benevolence. And moments like that remind me that peace isn't passive. Peace is responsive. Real peacemaking. But not everybody's need is visible like a burning house. There are other fires that burn quietly in our lives, right? In our homes, in our world. 7 years ago, we as a church decided to become part of the Shalem Mental Health Network. We decided that this would be an important step for us as a way of expressing one of our other values of peace and responsibility. As a community, we knew that many in our congregation didn't have access to professional counseling because they don't work in a job that offers health benefits, and counseling would be an expense they wouldn't have money for. So many people just do without. And we realized that peace of mind for those struggling with anxiety, for those struggling with troubled marriages, that if we could somehow offer help for those who are grieving, you see, those are solvable problems that we can do something about. And Shalem uses this CAP model, where churches pay based on use. And so everybody in your congregation has access to 6 free counseling sessions with one of many different professional counselors who are also Christian. Now, over the years, we have invested thousands of dollars in marriages, in people grieving, in people struggling with anxiety or loss. And it has been transformative to watch. Now, not only have we given access to everybody at the parish, but over the years, many have asked if neighbors or coworkers or friends who do not attend, if they could have access to the counseling. And so we had to find a unique way to solve that problem, to navigate that, because it's not normative, but we did, and we have. And to date, we have helped hundreds without ever knowing how. It's totally confidential. There's a simple 1-800 number that they call, and I don't have access to who uses the program. We just get the bill. And when it's a big one, our serve team looks at each other and believes that, you know what, we are anonymously creating peace, and we may never know for whom. But we actually do sometimes. We see it. We see it in restored marriages. We see it in people who are managing grief. We see it in people who are learning to navigate their anxiety. And we choose not to see this as an expense in our budget. Instead, we've made the choice to see this as an investment. But sometimes, even counseling can't fix what's broken. So over the years, we've had couples that have separated, and a few messy separations have had one of the partners come and ask if I could tell their former spouse or partner to no longer come to the parish because it makes them uncomfortable. There have been long, painful talks about betrayal, about heartbreak, about the ache of seeing someone move on before you're ready. Well, I get it. I can imagine. But as a church, we made a commitment, not to peacekeeping. We've made a commitment to peacemaking. And peacemaking walks right into it. And while it's true that some things can't be repaired, that doesn't mean that they have to be wasted. And we've learned to look for grace in the messiest of places. We've learned to look for grace to find a better way forward when the old way is gone, when the doors are closed. We recognize that peace isn't always a tidy solution. It isn't always resolution. Peace is a direction. It's a North Star. It's the light we keep steering towards. And so we arrange for shared custody of space, of belonging, of community. We've found a way to navigate this by arranging for the shared idea of this time together. And when one partner asks me to tell the other one not to come anymore, I remind them gently that as long as both are here for honest reasons, then our job is to actually help you navigate that. You see, because our goal isn't just to keep the peace, but to move towards wholeness, even when the way there is awkward, imperfect, or full of tension. Because the same courage that it takes to make peace in a broken relationship, I think, is reflective of what it takes to make peace in a broken world. We have to stop talking about peace as an idea, as if we could reason our way into a tidy, sensible closure. Peace isn't found in theory. Peace is made in motion. We make the path by walking it. And when we do, peace rarely looks grand or impressive. Instead, it's often smaller, humbler. Sometimes peace is hidden in the quiet work of love and listening. And that's why our value of discovery matters so much. It keeps us searching, longing for the unique ways that God is already present where we haven't yet shown up. You see, we've learned that peacemaking doesn't ask who's right. Real peacemaking asks who's hungry, who's been left out. It's experienced through paint-stained hands, through shared meals, through the simple courage to care. And not everything we've done over the years as a parish has gone the way we've hoped. I wouldn't be fully honest if I told you that everything's worked out perfectly. Not everything has. Some things have gone south, but we've chosen to believe that that doesn't mean that they've been wasted. Because peace isn't measured by outcomes. It's shaped by the journey. And it's that journey that transforms us slowly, beautifully, into the very heart of God. And this is where we must be willing to be misunderstood. Because love in its truest form almost always is. Peacemaking isn't tidy work. Not at all. Peacemaking is creation work. It's shaping meaning out of the void. It's the ongoing act of resurrection. Peacemaking is life where we least expect to find it. Thanks for listening.